Welcome everyone to this webinar. Today's topic, the topic of today's webinar is Zero Trust. We thought as we get towards the end of 2019, we'll pick a topic that's becoming even more important in today's modern enterprise. For those of you who probably are somewhat familiar with Zero Trust, it's really a security paradigm that initially started by talking about how to really look at user access to critical data, making sure that you have least privileged access to the critical data that is in your enterprise, largely in your data center. But as we see the growth of smart devices that are sort of enabling digital transformation, devices such as IoT and OT devices, as well as sort of a move to hybrid cloud, multi-cloud architectures, even for operational parts of the network. Zero Trust really is sort of expanding, quote unquote, to incorporate all of that you're trying to protect, because it's no longer just about your critical data in your data center, but all of your critical business processes that are running across all parts of your network. Those critical processes are as important, and any kind of security exposure to those can be equally disruptive, or perhaps even more disruptive to your overall business. So we picked this topic today, and we're going to talk about Zero Trust holistically. So not just about IoT and OT, but holistically, because IoT and OT have become part of the entire ecosystem of the modern enterprise. So we're going to talk about how to incorporate that as you look at embracing Zero Trust going forward. So quick intros. I'm Sandeep Kumar, Senior Director of Product Marketing at Fore Scout. And today I have with me Dr. Chase Cunningham from Forrester Research, who is the expert on Zero Trust. Hey Chase, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Great. Appreciate that. And for those of you who may not have been familiar with Forrester's role in Zero Trust has been around for a number of years. It was originally proposed or prescribed by Forrester a while back, and really what triggered that was, as perimeters were fading, the concept of having micro perimeters and starting to look at segmentation much more proactively became far more important. And so that's what the originations of Zero Trust are. As Chase took on the mantle a few years ago at Forrester, he's evolved Zero Trust. It's really a lot better defined, and he's defined how organizations can really implement the key tenets of Zero Trust. So we're going to touch some of those topics today, as well as talk about how you should go about thinking about Zero Trust in the modern enterprise. Then I'll talk a little bit about how Fore Scout can help you through that journey. And then we picked 3 principles here that we think are important to pay attention to. For those of you who may have known Zero Trust for a long time, these are things that you have to incorporate in Zero Trust today because of the multi-cloud adoption, the IoT and IT-OT convergence that is going on, that may require you to think about Zero Trust just a little bit differently, and not really changing the overall paradigm, but sort of expanding how you think about Zero Trust. And so we'll talk about those 3, and then hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. Also, with respect to questions, we do have, we're taking questions in the question window, so please ask your questions along the way. Don't save them till the end. If there's an opportune topic or time to discuss or address your question, we will pick them and take them along the way. So with that said, Chase, why don't you walk us through what Zero Trust looks like today, how it's evolved over the last few years?
Sure, glad to do that. Just to give you a bit of background on where Zero Trust has kind of come from and evolved from, the sort of general understanding of the failed perimeter-based security model actually kind of came out in about a decade ago. There was a group called the Jericho Forum that was doing a lot of work on figuring out new ways for enterprises to build infrastructure and look at the sort of move beyond those antiquated and outdated builds. So that they started kind of coming up with this concept of, well, we can't have these big walls anymore. We need to move forward. Then John Kindervag, who was at Forrester a little bit after that, took that early impetus and kind of evolved it forward to say, well, okay, let's look at micro perimeters. Let's look at not trusting whatever's within the environment itself, and let's focus on data security and really dial in on that to implement this sort of broader strategic approach to fixing enterprise security. And then fast forward to about 2017 timeframe, we took that, we formalized it. And what we did by formalizing it was we came up with this framework, which is that graphic you see on the right there. And the point of that graphic is really to say we think that there are 7 components that are needed in order to get to a semblance of zero trust, not the ultimate perfect end state, but it is based on those 7 things, the taking care of the people, the devices, the networks, the workloads, all focusing on the security of the data that's within that enterprise. And when we say data, we don't necessarily mean a specific line item in a database. We mean whatever is of value to that organization that would be a critical asset. Maybe it's a process, maybe it's a piece of data, maybe it's the formula for Coca-Cola, whatever that is, that's in the center of that framework and that build for zero trust. And then enabling it with automation, orchestration, and being able to see what's going on and doing it quicker, better, faster through visibility and analytics. So those 7 things are the framework for ZTX, which is where zero trust kind of lives now. Within that, there are some basic tenets that we think everyone needs to understand as far as sort of the evolved approach here. We want you to focus on the outcomes. A lot of times in security, people get really sort of wrapped around trying to fix what is immediately in front of them, and they don't think about what is the actual outcome of this going to be. Security, as it stands today, should actually be a business enabler, should not be a business detractor. So you need to think about the outcomes in order to get there. You need to think about benefiting the business and the users and those folks that are going to be operating in that environment. We want to focus on designing from the inside and out, from micro to macro. We want to fix very small problems, things that are fixable, that are relatively binary in nature, that we can see, gaining infrastructure control from the inside of the infrastructure, working our way outward. We don't want to try and fix things on the periphery of the enterprise, because that's a really big problem that we seem to not be able to solve at scale. Let's start with things that are core to us, that are close to the center of the infrastructure, and work our way outward. We want to start with the assets and data that needs protection, that is the most critical to us, because that's what we're ultimately there to defend anyway. We push this sort of concept of contested space in front of people all the time, of that there will be things within the enterprise that you are never able to necessarily fix 100%, and you have to be able to understand that and realize it and live with it. And you should be focusing your maximum effort on the stuff that you can bulletproof. If you know you're never going to win there, you may have to just say, look, that's a neighborhood that we only visit when we have to. Anything else, we're going to try and really keep it as secure as possible, and we'll fix that first. Access is key to this. The most secure enterprise on the planet is the one that no one ever uses, and that's not where we live. We live in a world where people are constantly engaging, constantly getting access, going through networks, etc. You've got to be able to say, I know what the access sort of parameters that are taking place there, and how am I making sure that that access is being controlled. Least privilege is key to this, because if you look at the history of exploitation, you look at where compromises have gone from bad to end of days, it's been when privileges were escalated, it's been when shared accounts were had too much privilege, it's been when administrator privileges were gained. All those things are privilege escalations that shouldn't have occurred, and if you can limit that, you're vastly increasing your ability to limit the blast radius. And then we need to be able to inspect and log all traffic, and the reason we say that is because that ties into your visibility and analytics. If you can't inspect and log everything, you're never going to see what you need to see. You're not going to know what you need to know. And if you don't know those things, if you don't have visibility, if you don't have understanding and insight, how can you ever hope to have accurate response and accurate remediation? So these are the core tenets of where we see zero trust now. The great thing about this being a grand strategy is that it is constantly evolving, but these core tenets are the sort of key pieces that we think is where things will continue to evolve from. So just a couple of more core principles within this. Connecting from a particular segment must not determine which services can be accessed. Access is always granted based on these things: what we know about you, what we know about the entity. And notice I don't necessarily say the user, the access, or whatever, what we know about the entity. We remind people all the time that the entity in this space could be a thermostat, could be a refrigerator, could be an elevator. It doesn't matter, whatever it's trying to do. Everything nowadays has an identity. IoT and OT devices have just as much identity, if you will, as any users. So that entity, we need to know what it's doing, and then we need to know what needs to be authorized. And we only authorize it for the purposes of that transaction, and we only authorize it with the level of privileges that are needed by that entity to do whatever is needed for the purposes of business. And of course, never trust, always verify. We're not doing default configurations here. We want to remove that. We want to make sure that things are being controlled, things are being maintained, and that we don't allow stuff to occur just because the system says that it's supposed to take place. We shouldn't be letting that type of transaction propagate. It should be, you need it, here it is, this is why, do your thing, and then we're going to kill that connection and move on.
It's a really important point, Chase. And the three points that you made back, and I'm just going to go back to your slide for a moment, that you made. It's interesting when you talk about know about the entity and then really then determine the access. They really kind of sort of mirror the approach that we've taken at ForScout for visibility and control. So always start with visibility across your extended enterprise networks, and then go to control. And for those of the folks in our audience who are familiar with ForScout, you're probably aware of us, aware that our roots were in network access control, which is sort of the access piece of traditionally user-based devices, because that's what the landscape largely looked like 10 years ago. But instead of focusing only on authentication, which is a lot of what user-based devices do, we kind of took a visibility-first approach to NAC. So know and get context about the user, about the endpoint, about the entity that is trying to access your network, and then incorporate that context into the authentication process to determine access. So that's kind of been our approach for network access control, and that's the same approach we are mirroring for Zero Trust. When we look at how we are approaching Zero Trust and how we're designing our Zero Trust platform, you look at the concept of visibility first. Identify the attack surface, or as Chase really mentioned, right? We got to focus on the outcomes, and so you've got to figure out, okay, what am I going to protect? You're not going to look at all of your assets, all of the entities on your network in the same way. You're going to look at what are your critical assets, whether they are data, whether they're processes, whether they're users or devices that you want to protect. If you don't know what is on your network, you're not going to be able to identify the important assets that you need to protect. And that's where then you need to focus on the outcome, which is how do I go about doing micro-perimeterization, micro-segmentation around those particular entities. Then when you look at that, the next step sort of that ForScout helps you with is to understand how those entities are communicating on the network. When you think about implementing Zero Trust, when it went from sort of a paradigm to much more of a concept that could be implemented and formalized as Chase did over the last few years, you've got to now think about how are we going to implement it on top of existing networks. Most of you don't have the luxury of completely re-architecting your network. You definitely will make some changes, ongoing changes to incorporate Zero Trust, but you've got to layer that on. So understanding how your assets and your entities are communicating across the network, what are legitimate communications, what are things that are anomalous communications, become a really important part before you then start designing your segmentation strategy. For segmentation strategy, think holistically. This is a point that we're going to talk about in a little bit. You have data flows that are going across all parts of your network. It's not just securing data flows in your data center, your edge devices, the IoT and OT, the sensors, the monitors, the control automation devices are becoming equally important because think of a scenario where these sensors and monitors are feeding information back to the data center, back to applications, back to analysis that acts on that data. So if you've got a compromise in a very critical business process in manufacturing or transportation or something like that, where your sensors and monitors, that part of your network is being compromised, a malicious actor can then send fabricated data from sensors and monitors to the application services and analysis services that are sitting in your data center that will act upon those and then send commands to your control automation devices to change things in transportation networks, such as the trains that go around in our airports, etc. And so if you're acting on bad data, you can have a really tremendous negative impact, business impact, as well as safety and security impact to human life that you've got to think of. So when you think about segmentation, think holistically, look at all of your business processes, and then once you've designed that, then look at what policies you want to enforce. You can always start small. Chase mentioned start from the inside out. You probably want to keep some of those things in monitoring mode, whereas you may automate and enforce the policies in other parts of your network, and then monitor for your violations. Make sure you're comfortable in certain areas before you move on to the next. And that's kind of the way we've designed our Zero Trust platform, which really starts with the products that I've listed over here. iSight, iSegment, and iControl are our products that are part of our platform. They're designed to work together. They're not really individual products that are loosely integrated. They're actually sharing a platform. And they're designed to start with visibility, like iSight for visibility, and then move on to iSegment and iControl to implement your trust journey. The I obviously indicating that everything is based on visibility that we provide in the first step, and without that sight, you can't really think about doing segmentation or control with confidence. So that's kind of how we layer on top of the formalization of the Zero Trust that Chase just talked about. And what we thought today we'd do is pick a few new principles that, Chase, you've mentioned in some of your reports, the ecosystem report that you published earlier this year, or the WAVE that was recently published in Zero Trust, and talk about how you need to incorporate some concepts in your Zero Trust journey beyond the original concept of user access to data. And obviously, we'll start with complete visibility. We've talked about that, but then also think about identity, incorporate identity beyond users and IAM. Chase mentioned that everything has an identity. It's not just users anymore. It's all of your IoT and OT devices, and we'll talk about how do you incorporate that identity into your Zero Trust implementation, and then think about segmentation and enforcing policy everywhere. Segmentation has always been a key pillar of Zero Trust, but now it's really about enforcing policy across your entire network and not just focusing on individual silos, because the goal isn't to sort of over-segment one part of the network and then leave the rest of the network flat and potentially open to compromise, because the concept of least privilege is super important. All of the various exploits that we've seen literally start from somebody getting access to some less important part of the network, but then being able to traverse laterally across the network to be able to get a hold into something more important, whether it's data or whether it's some kind of business process that they could be impacting. So we'll talk about these three. And so, Chase, let's start with the first one, which is complete visibility, and share with us why it's becoming even more important in today's modern network.
Yeah, I think visibility is something that we kind of get lost in the mix with. A lot of people will say, oh, well, I see what's going on in my network. And when you get into it a little bit deeper, you start asking about, well, how much do you see? Usually they're not able to give you a very real answer to that. And when you think about how important visibility is, just looking at this graphic here, your attack surface has rapidly expanded. You think about third parties, you think about the social side of this, you think about all the fraud sort of stuff that's bouncing around, then you think about all the IT, OT, manufacturing, endpoint, mobile device, other users. Like, it just becomes really, really big, really, really fast. And if you're not able to have visibility, if you can't see what's going on, you don't know when new things connect, you don't know what devices are doing what on the network, you don't have any opportunity to actually be able to adequately respond and remediate those problems. It's basically the same thing as saying, if you don't have an understanding of kind of your own health, how will you ever know when you're not feeling well? If your organization is not able to leverage solutions that let you dial in on what normal looks like and normal in totality looks like, you won't ever see those aberrant behaviors that give you indications that things are outside the bounds of that normality. Most companies that I talk to and do workshops with, they don't actually have a really good understanding of what total normal looks like. They usually have a good understanding of what kind of network traffic is there. They usually have a decent understanding of what users are on the network and which devices that are sort of corporate managed might be talking to the network, but that's really about it. There are so many moving pieces in infrastructure nowadays, and there's more coming all the time, that it is absolutely imperative that you're able to see what's going on. And that's why we spent the time with the framework to create a pillar specifically for the visibility and analytics. If you're not looking at what's going on, then you never have a capability of response. And it's just a foundational ground truth statement in Zero Trust and in basic good security, kind of, that old, people like to reference Sun Tzu in this space, know thyself, right? You've got to be able to know thyself, and the only way that you know thyself in this space is you see what's going on everywhere all the time.
That's a good point, Chase. I also like your analogy of organization and organism. Organizations are like organisms. You got to know your health. When we talk to most of the customers that are looking at the ForScout platform and look at the type of visibility that they have, this is pretty common chart that we see. They've got a pretty good understanding of their data center, where their critical application servers are residing, whether it's virtual or physical. More and more virtual, obviously, nowadays, virtualized nowadays. But then as soon as you start going beyond that, even when you look at cloud, they're using the public cloud, hybrid cloud for multiple aspects, not only their managed application servers, but their development organization, DevOps, et cetera. And those parts that sit outside of IT's domain start becoming a little bit yellow because they just don't have the same level of visibility into what's going on. A lot of organizations, one of the organizations that we really just recently were working with, discovered that all of their development workloads that were out there had internet-facing access. They just didn't have the right security group set up. They were using AWS. And so, you start going beyond the data center in the cloud, or even now in the campus. Campus used to be like a really, really well-managed domain, well, maybe not really well managed, but far better managed 10 years ago because of the type of devices that were connecting the campus network. They were largely corporate managed devices that were issued by the corporation, that even if you got to take home, you were bringing it back with you, and so the users were authenticating on those devices. With BYOD, that started getting a little bit murky, where people were allowed to bring personal devices. Everyone implemented that a little bit differently. Some required a level of authentication, some others didn't, and put them in different networks. But the campus has gone from being more green to yellow as BYOD, and now IoT is also getting incorporated. And so with IoT and OT, that part, because these devices don't authenticate the way user-based devices do, the situational awareness of what is on the network very rapidly drops into the red zone. And this is pretty normal with most customers that we see, and the reason they're looking at ForScout is because we are getting known as the device visibility platform across your extended enterprise. Being able to take that inconsistent visibility that I showed and make it consistent across all of your network domains, which means all of your different kinds of devices, whether they're virtual or physical endpoints, or whether they are traditional mobile IoT, OT, whether they are network devices that are out there, and across all kinds of infrastructure, whether they're connecting to your physical infrastructure or software-defined virtual cloud infrastructure. We do have a platform that uses network-based techniques to be able to give you that visibility. And when we talk about visibility, we're not just talking about breadth of visibility, but also really the depth of visibility. So we always talk about it, the depth in three dimensions. One is just knowing what is connecting to your network, and that discovery capability that we provide is at connect time, because that's when you have to make the determination of access. There's no point in discovering a device minutes or hours after it is connected to the network, because that is plenty of time for that device to have done some kind of harm, either maliciously or unknowingly, because it was vulnerable to certain exploits. We're largely a network-based approach for this, which is interrogating your network through active techniques, listening to your network through passive techniques, because one of the other things that's really kind of important when it comes to zero trust is if you want to know what is connected to your network, you've got to talk and ask your network. You're not going to ask your devices, because then you're only going to know about your managed devices. The other thing that we do beyond discovery is give you the ability to understand the identity of devices. We'll talk about this a little bit more here in a moment, where identity is far easier to determine for corporate devices that authenticate on your network and users that authenticate on your network versus those that do not. And then we go one step deeper and talk about assessing endpoint hygiene, security posture of various connected things, various entities, because that's going to determine how you're going to apply your segmentation policies, how you're going to respond if you've got vulnerable devices or configuration issues, security agents, patches that may be missing, IOCs that may be indicators of compromises on various devices. You've got to look and take that into account as you react to certain things that are happening on your network. And so that's really the core foundation of our platform with our iSight product that provides this visibility, so you can then decide how you're going to implement policy on top of that. And I've listed a few attributes of our platform, which is that it is agentless. It does not rely on requiring a footprint on various entities and various endpoints. We do real-time discovery and classification using multiple techniques. And one of the big things that we get asked about is how does it work across heterogeneous environments? Because most modern enterprises have different environments, different network environments. It's, in the past was all physical networks, and even there, folks had physical infrastructure from different vendors. But now when you look at a combination of physical, virtual, SD, and cloud, then obviously it's going to be a very, very heterogeneous network. And the answer is yes, we do talk to all of the different networking infrastructure technologies, whether they're physical, virtual, cloud, and because we're doing it at a scale of trying to give you visibility into all of your devices, it has to be a very, very scalable approach. And just to give you guys and a feel for our scalability, we have our largest deployment now with our ForScout platform at over 2 million entities, 2 million endpoints or devices and users that are being managed, because when you incorporate all parts of your network that I've shown on the top, that's kind of what you really need to do. If you're a large enterprise, you're going to scale into the millions. So that's kind of really how we talk about providing that visibility that Jay's mentioned, which is becoming so important or is so important. The second principle that we talk about is, and we alluded to that, is a little bit about identity and the concept of identity and how it's sort of expanding as we incorporate IoT and OT. So Chase, walk us through why, obviously identity is super important in granting access, and why we should look at identity a little bit more broadly.
Yeah, so it's actually research that we're working on for next year around redefining identity in the sort of grander context, because I mean everything nowadays has some form of identity, whether it's got an IP address or a username or a MAC address or something like that. There is some sort of quote identity or identifier for almost everything that's out there that talks to the network, and the ways that you sort of leverage that, in our opinion, around IoT space for Zero Trust is really doing these things, being able to have a constant asset inventory, know in real time or as close to real time as possible what assets are jumping online, offline, on the network, off the network, because it's a very dynamic space. Again, back to that earlier point of eliminating default configurations. We don't want stuff shipped to us from the factory that we plug in and turn on, and it's sitting there on the internet with admin as its management interface for the planet to leverage whenever it wants. So you need to be able to work around those issues and eliminate that. Excuse me.
Yep.
Functional microsegmentation. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Chase.
Oh, functional microsegmentation, and why I say functional microsegmentation over just microsegmentation is because there's a bit of a disconnect there between most people when they talk about microsegmentation, they usually mean really small VLANs. When I talk about functional microsegmentation, I mean being able to functionally segment things all the way down to the individual identity, the asset, the application, the user, the device, whatever it is, segment that thing down so that it lives within its own little sort of microcosm and can't go anywhere. We want to be able to do that. We talk about not cross-pollinating, not having things that kind of are transitory in nature. Some stuff people in one organization will say is OT, and over here it's IoT, and then this device is, not a device, it is something else, and it just kind of moves in this ethereal manner back and forth between things. We don't want to allow cross-pollination because that makes tracking harder, and if we can't track stuff, we can't remediate, respond. And then I like these last couple pieces around focusing on the binary nature of IoT. Most of the time when you look at IoT devices, they're called smart devices, which is kind of nifty and cool, but they're really not that, quote, smart. They're there to do one or two things and do it very well in an automated fashion, leveraging network connectivity. A thermostat should only do thermostat stuff. It shouldn't be, looking around the network for other shares. So being able to dial in and leverage the binary-ish sort of nature of IoT is a pretty critical component that you're able to leverage to give you better command and control. And then those last pieces around analysis and metrics for anomalies and responding decisively, back to that earlier point about seeing everything and having really good visibility and analytics, you need to know what metrics are, you need to know what the value is you get out of that data, and then you need to be able to respond to anomalies that occur and do it quickly and with decisiveness, not sitting around doing analysis and going, oh, well, is this what I think it is? Is that, just this weird thing that's occurring because there's a misconfiguration? If you don't have really good analytics and you don't have really good data that will tell you the telemetry that's of value, then you're not able to dial in and actually fix anything.
Good point, Chase. And talking about smart or unsmart IoT devices, the good thing about IoT devices is that they are meant to do one or two things, as you mentioned, really well. That's their sort of sole purpose in life, right? A video surveillance camera has a specific purpose, which is different from a video conferencing camera, even though they're both sort of IP cameras. The downside of IoT is just the diversity of devices. And I've shown examples of IoT devices and OT devices that are used in all sorts of different industries. Obviously, every customer doesn't have all of the industries based on their industry, but you're talking about, as opposed to tons of operating systems and perhaps a few hundred manufacturers, you're now talking about thousands of manufacturers and thousands of different types of devices that are out there. And so understanding their identity becomes really, really difficult because they're not meant to authenticate. There's no user behind it. They're not meant to authenticate, or at least today they don't authenticate the way user-based devices authenticate. And so that's part of the challenge that ForeScout is solving with our Zero Trust platform, is to really give the concept of identity to these IoT devices that are on your network. And the way we do that is through a crowdsourced approach, because no other approach is going to work in the domain of IoT and OT, given the diversity. We have crowdsourced device insight from our customer base. For those of you who may not be aware, we've got about 25% of the Global 2000 as our customers across all industries. So it's a very good cross-section of devices, about 11 million plus devices that we have in our device cloud, that we then use to understand the various aspects of these devices, various attributes, behaviors of how some of these devices are acting on the network, and create profiles that we provide all of our customers, through which they can identify and classify these IoT devices, so they can attach the concept of identity and know that, okay, this particular IP address is, if I'm a healthcare organization, is an MRI machine versus a physical security badge reader or camera that is monitoring my premises. And we use a combination of gleaning device attributes of the device, protocol analysis. Various devices speak different protocols that are above and beyond just the basic IP protocols, because they're very, very specific in nature, these IoT devices, as well as continuously monitoring their network behavior and understanding their common patterns to glean and tell customers, okay, this is the kind of device. So I think this is a really, really important concept that has to be done in an automated manner. A customer can't really manually classify their IP addresses for all of their IoT and OT devices and identify them. And so this is a very, very important capability that, Chase, you've also called out in your latest Zero Trust Wave, where you talked about ForeScout being a very, very key platform and being the platform for IoT and OT security, because of the ability for us to attach identity to these IoT and OT devices. The great thing about that is that once you have that, it's difficult to do, but once you have that concept of identity for IoT and OT, as Chase mentioned, these devices are meant to do one or two things in the network. So then being able to look at segmentation and putting them in their appropriate zones so they only have access to what they need to do becomes far easier once you have the automated identity. And that's where we talk about, doing segmentation everywhere. So I'll turn it back to you, Chase, to talk about how important it has become to enforce segmentation policy everywhere.
Yeah, so microsegmentation is actually kind of a difficult thing to do if you're not leveraging these sort of four components that we think are pretty critical to that capability. And one on software-defined segmentation. Obviously, with everything being as software-defined and virtual as it is right now, you need to be able to leverage software-defined controls so that you can actually segment things. If you're not doing that, there's no way to, like you were talking about, with hundreds of thousands of devices or tens of thousands, to physically walk around and go off and segment everything in an infrastructure. You just can't do that. So you got to be able to do it at speed and at scale using software-defined approaches. Isolate the application in a virtual environment. Most of the time, we kind of live in a world where things are usually sort of either in virtual space or not in virtual space, or close to virtual space in some way, shape, or form. We want to be able to keep the applications and things living in as much of the virtual space as possible. Why? Because that's where we get the greatest amount of control, and that's where we're able to do things fast because it's moving at the speed of electrons. Focusing on east and west communication, this is back to that visibility and analytics side of the equation, and being able to know what's going on in there. Most of the time, organizations have a pretty good line on what's going on north-south, kind of into and out of the network. But when we look at what's going on across and within the network, lateral movement, those type of things, they don't usually see it very well. So when we really think about this, we want to be able to look at east-west just as well as north-south. And then security being defined at a very granular level, back to what we talked about earlier, leveraging those capabilities so that you can actually very, very specifically get close to that control space. And the way that you do that is being extremely granular in your approach. The further down you can drive that control system, the better control you're gaining. The better control you're gaining, the more power you have. And that's what we're ultimately trying to get to in this space. And when I, talk with lots of organizations doing workshops about microsegmentation, it can be a little bit hard to wrap your head around how valuable this can be. So this is what I think is a pretty applicable sort of tangential story to, the difference between microsegmentation and segmentation. Everyone knows the story about the Titanic segmented. It did have watertight integrity, but it was only up to a certain level in the hull. They never thought about, well, what would happen if we hit an iceberg per se, because we happen to sail through areas where there are icebergs, and we have 2 or 3 or 4 compartments that are all compromised at once. Oh, and by the way, once that water comes in and it reaches above the level of that current level of segmentation, we have a real problem. Then we wind up with a James Cameron movie. Segmentation was applied. This was generally segmented, but it was not micro-segmented, and it was not functionally segmented so that they could operate in a space when everything went to the worst possible case scenario. Had that been the reality, had they segmented and even had the capability to segment along those lines, things would have been much different. I'm retired U.S. Navy, and this is the USS Stark FFG-31, which was a ship that was out quite a while ago in the Persian Gulf. Miscommunications happened, and it was actually hit by an Exocet cruise missile, which is a cruise missile designed to sink ships. That's what it looked like before it got hit. This is what it looked like after. But this was a missile that was designed to sink ships. It hit it broadside, should have sunk the ship, but because in the Navy, we practice very, very closely, very controlled micro-segmentation within the infrastructure of that vessel, the ship was able to not only survive, but return to service. It did not take on water past the level of where that segmentation was supposed to occur. It was segmented all the way down to individual drains within individual spaces. There was no proliferation of water between compartments. Yes, it was catastrophic. Yes, it was a very, very bad day, but because of the way that segmentation was applied and was applied functionally, they were able to respond at speed and at scale and limit the damage and keep that ship afloat. So, just to wrap people's head around the difference between segmentation, which is the Titanic, where they had it, and yes, it made sense, and yes, they kind of knew what the problem, what might likely be, and functional micro-segmentation, USS Stark, hit by a missile that was designed to sink a ship, did not sink the ship because the crew knew how to segment that thing all the way down to individual drains and individual compartments and keep the ship afloat. That's what you're looking for within your infrastructure, is that level of control, that level of response, and that level of capability when things go to hell, because it's very likely that they will in the space that we operate in today.
A good analogy, Chase. And so, it is, like you said, it is very hard. So how do we all be a little bit more like the U.S. Navy? We're not going to go try and do work on compartmentalizing ships, but the reason it's so hard is because when you start thinking about doing microsegmentation enterprise-wide, then you have to think about what I've shown on this slide, which is all your assets. Go across multiple tools, because your network isn't just a single vendor network. It's a heterogeneous network that goes and has become more complicated because of the adoption of software-defined infrastructure, virtual infrastructure, cloud infrastructure, etc. So you've got to, you've got to go across these various domains, and that also means that you've got different tools in those domains to be able to enforce segmentation controls. So you're not going to be able to just work with one tool to be able to enforce the controls. You're going to have to go across multiple tools and multiple domains. And so when you look at how would you put your arms around that, it does become a pretty big problem. And you start thinking about, okay, how do I do it like the U.S. Navy? And so what we've done as we've expanded our Zero Trust platform recently is try to tackle that problem, which is that you've got all of these enforcement points within various parts of the network that do a really good job at enforcing the controls. But it's difficult to do it in silos because of the lack of a unified policy layer that sort of ties these together, for lack of a better term, allows you to really think about policy logically across your various network domains, across your various enforcement technologies, whether it's your cloud enforcement technologies that are provided by the cloud providers like AWS, Azure, VMware with NSX, etc., or your overlay technologies that have agent-based that sit on top of that, or your network infrastructure, whether it's your software-defined network infrastructure or your physical infrastructure, which is still very, very important in your OT and campus networks. And that's kind of what really ForScout recently brought to the table with our iSegment product that became part of our platform, which really gives you that policy layer that goes across. It gives you the ability to first and foremost understand how all of your entities are communicating, understanding your traffic flows across all of your network, and map and visualize those flows to the logical taxonomy that you're going to use for segmentation, the taxonomy of users, application, services, devices that you're going to use. You're going to really incorporate business context because, as I said earlier, even when you look at IoT devices, an IP camera that is part of your video conferencing infrastructure is going to have a different segmentation logic applied to it than one that is part of your video surveillance infrastructure. So again, understanding that and understanding those traffic flows is sort of the first part that we provide, and then being able to design policies that are logical policies, not IP-based, not enforcement point-based, but really look at these various logical zones that you have created and design segmentation policies around that, and then simulate those policies to understand their impact. And that's really becoming a very, very critical part because implementing zero trust and segmentation is challenging for a lot of organizations because they lack the confidence that they're not going to inadvertently do some harm, inadvertently impact some legitimate traffic flows, some legitimate network communications. And so be able to simulate those policies to see their impact and even then fine-tune those policies when you determine that you didn't think of all of the legitimate communication paths, or you did identify some of the anomalous communication paths. Like Chase said, if you don't understand what is happening in your network, you're not going to be really able to then take the next step, which is to automate enforcement and then monitor and respond as potentially bad things happen, as potentially you have some weakness or vulnerability that is identified in some devices, or you've got a breach in a certain part of the network that you can respond to because you have applied microsegments across your network. And so that's how we're trying to help enterprises think of this problem, which is a very large problem to solve, and think about it holistically with the application of a policy layer that provides all of these capabilities and then works and orchestrates down with all of the enforcement points, which are your physical, virtual, cloud infrastructure, as well as your agent based and boundary-based next generation firewall technologies that implement the actual rules at your network. So that's sort of like a really important point that I wanted to enforce here, is about how do you go about doing this segmentation policy everywhere. So those are the three things as the modern enterprise network really evolves, really becomes more complex, that you guys should be thinking about as you're thinking about undertaking the Zero Trust journey. At this point, there are a couple of questions in the chat window, so we'll go ahead and open it up. If you've got some more questions, please go ahead and ask them in the question window, I should say, not the chat window. But I'll go ahead and take this question somebody asked, which is really more about Zero Trust, Chase. It talks about the fact that, Zero Trust, with the incorporation of these various elements beyond the network, users, applications, workloads, is the importance of the network pillar changing with Zero Trust. So I know you've written more about it, so maybe I'll let you respond to that question.
Yeah, I think that it is changing. I think that years ago, the next-gen firewall and the network itself were kind of the singular control spaces for a lot of what goes on in security. But over the course of the last, say, 3 to 5 years, there's been so much evolution in controls we can put around users and devices and workloads and applications and all these other subcomponents that we have a lot more functional control in the space, so that we can get way more granular in taking back the ownership of those areas where we might have problems. And yes, the network is extremely important. Yes, next generation firewalls are extremely important, but there's a bigger capability set that's offered by the solutions that are out there, that you don't necessarily have to put all of your eggs into the basket of network or firewalls. There are other ways to build a very secure environment infrastructure tangentially to leveraging just that control space.
That's a good point. Go ahead and ask your question, guys. I've got one other question that's come up, which is around what you mentioned earlier, Chase, which is data. You said data sitting in the center, but don't think of it as data. Don't just think of it as intellectual property, like maybe your Coca-Cola formula. Think of it more broadly. Can you expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, and that's something that we're actually doing research to sort of realign on over the next year as well, because we think it's a kind of a hole in where the current definition sits. And it could be a process. It could be if you're a manufacturer and you have proprietary ways that you build something. Maybe the ways that you build it are that sort of quote data. But the point is, whatever is critical to the business is where you want to focus your controls around it, and being able to have that optimal sort of management, maintain, and control space. It doesn't necessarily, provide value to the sort of industry at large to say data, because you may not necessarily have data as the thing that is the area of biggest concern to you.
Good point. So no other questions right now. If you do have a question, please go ahead and send it in. I wanted to point out a couple of other important resources that if you're interested in understanding more about what just Chase mentioned about Zero Trust, because obviously Zero Trust isn't something that you implement in a day or even a week. It is a journey. There's a really good research report from Forrester about implementing Zero Trust, almost like a sort of a Zero Trust security playbook. How do you go about doing that? It's available on the link that's shown below. You can also probably just Google it and search for it and be able to download it through ForScout. Also, in terms of implementing enterprise-wide network segmentation, what I alluded to, how do you really adopt that approach that the Navy has, which is microsegment everywhere in your enterprise, We have a webinar next Wednesday, December 11th, where we go into a lot more detail around how the ForScout platform enables that capability. Today we touched lightly on that, but we'll go into a lot more detail on that. And again, you can find that. There's a link below, but probably easier to just go to forscout.com/webinars, and you'll be able to find the link there. So with that, there are no more questions, so we'll wrap it up. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to having you attend our segmentation webinar next week, and have a great day, guys.